certainly, I think identity and access management is one of those key areas that allow you to direct via credential who's going where, and to be very, very specific about that. And that has to be constantly verified based on job positions and job changes, because that way, if someone changes jobs, that we make sure we measure where they're going and remove credentials and or add credentials. So, and that in itself is quite the move, right? And of course, like in a multi-cloud environment, certainly have to visualize your network. I think visualizing the traffic in the network and making those appropriate changes that you see from high traffic situations are very important. One of the downsides with apps, of course, is that in a worldwide organization like we have, we spread apps over multi-clouds. And then, of course, when we do the application development, we have to make sure that we know who's talking to who, and what that cloud is talking to, and to make sure that we have the right security side around that. Of course, breaches we have to measure, and we have to make sure we understand. The AWS breach last week, for example, we failed over one app to our virtual private cloud because, again, things were coming up very slow and it was impacting business. So I think managing those breaches and having that failover, unfortunately, is still required in a cloud environment, even though some people think the cloud is self-healing, maybe not as fast as your business needs it. And of course, the application remediation of security and the time it takes is an important measure, as is the network security, et cetera. So I believe in measuring the time it takes to remediate, because we have to keep on tightening that up and make it faster and make sure that we can plug those holes.
I think I want to challenge a little bit what you said at the beginning of this session, which is that with increased security measures or regulatory requirements, the process is going to get slowed down. Cybersecurity is complex, and we can't expect our business units or our developers to be experts. We can't even expect our cloud providers to understand all our organizational specific requirements, because we have standards, we have policies, we have procedures. It's just very complicated. What we found, I think that Blair mentioned it as well, is that checklists that really take the policies or the requirements, link it to the controls, and then link it to implementation simplifies the problem. If we start from the controls and the requirements and then adjust for all the variability of technologies and all the different cloud providers out there, it really then puts the security back in the hands of those who are implementing the solution. So we found it's really important to ensure that there's examples, FAQs, helpful aids, so that they can really then speed up their delivery and the accountability of those solutions. Now, the key is to remember that these checklists don't need to be static. You don't need to spend a number of years trying to figure out everything. You need to just put a stake in the ground and then mature the checklist as time goes on, and make sure you're having regular communication with stakeholders. We then measure against those checklists.
The cloud increases complexity, and for sure for us, we've embedded security, as I've heard before, right into our DNA and culture and start right at the start. But what I have noticed, and we kind of observed this during the Log4j event, was we were in this interconnected ecosystem, being all on the cloud ourselves and our other providers. So not only do we have our own internal checklist, but we're finding our partners have checklists. And I think that ecosystem of how do we keep ourselves constantly looking at these checklists, the questions coming in and the questions going out are changing. So I think it's an interesting strategy that has to be looked at, and also as I've heard before, the checklists are key to that.
I want to draw our attention to the fundamentals again. The first thing is we don't have good visibility in multi-cloud environments in many industries. Last year, working again with the feds, we actually did a multi-cloud hacking experiment. We asked the feds whether they would be able to detect a single source of attack against multiple cloud providers, all owned by the government, and if they would be able to correlate and triage. And the answer to the question was unfortunate. It's very difficult to be able to do this kind of thing effectively. So I think the first adage I would put forward in terms of how do you improve observability and visibility in multi-cloud environment is let's accept the fundamentals that you cannot prevent things that you cannot detect. So let's focus on our ability to detect security events across multiple disparate systems and orchestrate that data. That means that there are KPIs and KRIs that perhaps should surface for organizations who are moving into multi-cloud. If I'm in a multi-cloud environment, I want KRIs that are going to help me understand the maturity and the capabilities of my SIEM and my orchestration systems to be able to do that kind of incident detection and response. The other comment I would make is that we absolutely need to challenge our dashboards. Improving visibility in a multi-cloud environment means that I have to have good quality dashboards across my cloud, and that includes cybersecurity program management. We don't do a good job of building out cybersecurity dashboards for programs in-house, and in a multi-cloud environment, that becomes even more sophisticated, even more difficult. So my guidance for a lot of the organizations that we work with who are into a multi-cloud environment is focused on detection, ensure that you have the ability to orchestrate multiple disparate events, build out KRIs to look for those types of practices, and make sure, absolutely sure, that you have capabilities to be able to respond to those breaches when they happen downstream.
Actually, how we do security as a code, it starts there. We start by asking our data stewards who manages within the governance to bring into our what I call a DevSecOps environment to our developers. What are the specifics that are compliance, accessibility, etc., and all those things. So we have a foundation that we go by, and as part of that foundation, what we do is we take it, to move it into our CI/CD model. So we have a security as a code for two type of applications. So we build the architecture around what type of security as a code we would like to use for internal facing application, and what are the ones that we're doing for external facing applications. So we do have customers that use it as a SaaS product, and we have customers that use it internally through their apps. We have decided in the architecture specifically to create security, what we call a DevSecOps specifically to create, for example, at the URL level, to write codes within specific to that. So who can access this URL or not? Now, we do not enable them, but what we have we actually have written it inside so that we can decide, based on the requirement changes and whatnot, our development team easily can go in there and enable or disable whatnot, specific to a URL. So on the code development, we are a cloud native organization. So we predominantly do all of our work, infrastructure. We do have a hybrid environment, but we predominantly focus on a public base in terms of development because we utilize a lot of security that already exists as a services out there, such as Azure DevOps. So we follow that model and we just plug in the security in there. We have also another reason we do it in such a way, DevSecOps, is mainly because we not only have our own developers, we also have developers that are third party. So we want to have across all the development model follow the same standard. So we have been very, very specific in terms of putting the architecture in place, the requirement in place. Even on the application accessibility is very important for us. We actually keeping very specific code that we need to add in there. In short, what really key for us is to have a common architecture across DevSecOps. That's really what it is. And that's what we're following it based on the requirement coming from the governments.
I kind of follow DevSecOps mentality as remove blame, remove our own bias, and then get the teams to work together with the data. The data will be driven by a steering committee or a guild that determines what is my SDLC maturity rating for every app, which includes infrastructure. So I don't separate infrastructure and applications whatsoever. They should be both in the same SDLC methodology of testing it, create it, and validate it. I think some of the comments that Martin made and Blair made come very close together. I do think that security controls are key, but they should be inherited, not defined. What I mean by that is CSPMs exist today just so you don't have to do a lot of that custom work, especially within the public clouds, where you could just leverage a CSPM and say, here's the stuff I need to control. Please go and administer that multi-cloud for us. I think context-aware risk rating is one of the new segments in the market that not many people are aware of, but is the most important invention to date when it comes to security, which is, where is my object? Is it exploitable? And are those actions something that can damage us? So what it means by that is if I throw something out that I maybe didn't have controlled from the developers and security as code, and it somehow got to the environment because everybody uses what we call the path of least resistance. Security controls are nice, but are they actually being adopted is different. So context-aware risk rating helps you understand, is that exploitable or not? And then one other piece we didn't talk about, AppSec support teams. Devs are not good at security, and they're a persona. They were not trained to be security professionals, understand governance standards. So I feel like standing up an AppSec support team, which I've had in the past, which was as a CISO before, they taught everybody consistently how to improve it and then move your SDLC rating. So if I were to summarize, if you don't have an SDLC rating, then you don't have your delta metrics. Am I improving over time or am I degrading over time? Because gates, if you put them in, devs will go around them and be smart enough to get around them, because that's their job, get the features out. So I just wanted to say that if we're not accepting that we're not in good shape, it's going to be very hard to go forward to improve our posture until the data shows us that we're continuously improving.
First consideration is obviously people. Shlomo mentioned it, app developers are not necessarily security conscious. Getting a buy-in from the entire team from a culture perspective is really the first consideration, because as Shlomo mentioned, if you put high enough guardrails, they'll find a high enough ladder just to get around it. The second consideration on that very topic is whatever policy, whatever security as code policies I implement, does it still allow, or do my devs have the feeling that they're allowed to innovate, that they're not stymied, and quote unquote, like we let them do their job? Because if you don't, then they'll find the ways around it. What's important, sometimes often not mentioned, is when they do work within these boundaries and the culture is accepted, for example, and they do have drift, everything happens, violations happen. There has to be a process for them to be allowed to learn from these violations. What did they do? How did they get about to end up in that result in violating a guardrail, for example? The third one is really on understanding the workflow to remediation. So, violations of compliance, drift, security risk, whether it's like Shlomo said, whether it's in your infrastructure as code, whether it's in your APM, whether it's in your static code analysis, understand the efficacy and the effectiveness of your remediation workflow and what drives the devs to fix them. Different companies do it different way at different parts of their agile process, but you need to track the metrics here as to, if you simply message them on Slack and you have 10% code fix, then that's not enough and that's not acceptable. You need to understand the remediation effort that you have. And that's really the big considerations that I see in implementing the security as code.